Okay, welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a nice lunch. We're going to make a start of the second panel here. And so I'm going to introduce the moderator for this panel. So our moderator for Towards a Forest Restoration Bioeconomy is going to be Stephanie Carlisle. And Steph is the LCA practice lead at Seascale, which is a climate tech startup democratizing access to whole life carbon data and design strategy for the built environment, where she leads development of the platform's carbon accounting data and methods. Her research focus is on complex questions related to whole life carbon accounting, novel materials, land management, and building design. She has worked on the development of several whole building life carbon accounting tools and has contributed to state and federal policy. Steph is also a lecturer here at the Weitzman School of Design, where she teaches courses on urban ecology, on building materials, and on life cycle assessment in the departments of landscape architecture and architecture. So Steph will introduce our second panel. If you can join me in welcoming Steph Carlisle.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Nick. It's been such a wonderful day already. I can't believe it's only 2 o'clock and we have 2 fabulous panels left. So I'm going to be super brief and then just introduce our 3 panelists. We have a nice packed panel this time, and then hopefully we have a really good amount of time for Q&A and engagement all together. So this next panel is going to be a little bit of a shift. And we've had such good framing already this morning, as well as in the keynote last night. And we're gonna come and zoom really close in, I think, on the ground as well with this panel. And so we all know that the work of fuel reductions, the work of land management and land stewardship happens in the forest. But it's also enabled by a really diverse set of stakeholders, of agencies, of organizations, of industries, who are negotiating with each other about what it means to be on the land, who gets to work on the land, and how that work happens. So in this panel, we're going to talk a little bit about what is sometimes called the forest restoration bioeconomy or the forest bioeconomy. And our speakers on the panel are going to explore a couple different themes and show some real projects about this relationship between forest management, forest mitigation, and that bioeconomy question, including how we communicate the benefits of this work, who gets to do this work, how is the work paid for, how do we substantiate it, argue for it, advocate for it, especially. And so what we're really interested in here, I think, is this broader conversation and expanding the view of what it looks like to knit back together that relationship between the stewardship and the values that are provided to communities, to ecosystems, to landscapes, and to economies. So with that, I'm going to introduce the panelists as they come up. So first, we're going to hear from Gregg, whose PhD is a director of conservation science at Blue Forest. With a diverse background in environmental management, his research leverages design technology to empower others in protecting the planet. Gregg is passionate about science education, data visualization, and communication. He brings 20 years of expertise and over 50 peer-reviewed publications applying natural capital approaches and tools for quantifying ecosystem benefits to nature and people. So join me in welcoming Gregg.
Thank you, Steph. Pleasure to be here. I want to thank Nick and the entire School of Design and UPenn. I work for Blue Forest, and I'm a biogeographer by training. So a lot of this forestry work that we've been hearing about and fire is very new to me. And just this morning, learned so much and looking forward to learning more from you all later today. Blue Forest has a financial vehicle called the Forest Resilience Bond. And I'm going to talk to you today about how we're using that to tackle the wildfire crisis, forest and watershed resilience goals, and more. I'd like to start by just sharing this quote from a friend of ours, Paula. I think it's really captures the challenge that we have of no matter what we as scientists think we can do in terms of quantifying these benefits, at the end of the day, if we are not allowing others to acknowledge and sort of inducing this social change, these numbers, these scientific models don't really mean a lot. A little bit about Blue Forest. I have the privilege of working with a multidisciplinary team on conservation finance. Conservation finance, for those of you not familiar, are tools and strategies to secure funding for conservation objectives, and really extending beyond traditional funding sources, those traditional grants, including market-based approaches like private investment, payment for ecosystem services, and more. And simply put, it really aims to pay for these ecosystem benefits or avoided costs that we're seeing by taking financial investment and aligning that with conservation outcomes. Blue Forest's motto or slogan is science plus finance plus collaboration. And so in that spirit, we use science to quantify those benefits. We provide finance, including a 0% interest line of credit, to alleviate some of those cash flow constraints. And through our projects team and our external affairs comms teams, we're able to advance community partnerships. We've heard a lot about the wildfire crisis, and I've already gone in and hid some of my pre-post fire suppression slides. I think we've had enough of those for today. I don't have a quiz, unfortunately, Kat, to wake us up a little bit after lunch, but I think what this speaks to is why are we focused on wildfire at Blue Forest in the larger community? It's a huge economic burden, and we have aggressive restoration goals that are very costly, and that funding gap is huge. And so really we view this as a moment of opportunity. There's really unanimous support for some of these solutions, the importance of public and private partnership to catalyze these long-term partnerships and scale some of the novel funding vehicles that we're pursuing. I do have one of those slides though, actually, and I think it's helpful to look at the unmanaged forest to talk about one of these themes that's going to emerge in some of my case studies around ladder fuels and these crown fires that are happening and are really what are causing these high severity fires. With the managed scenario on the left, through thinning, prescribed fire, and other fuel treatments, it doesn't change the probability of fire, but it's really about changing the structure of the forest and changing that severity as we've talked about. So what are the goals of conservation finance? The biggest one is larger projects and access to non-traditional funding sources. We want to increase the pace and scale of this work and make landscape restoration happen faster. We also want to increase capacity so that we can provide contractors, specialists to be able to pursue those longer term funding contracts and operate from a pilot to a scale model and support the local biomass sector, which I will touch upon, and my colleagues on the panel will continue along that theme. But fundamentally, the model attracts diverse funding sources, that public-private partnership, not just the traditional grants, so that groups do not have to carry debt and they can pay back the loans with other partners over time as their funding schedule allows. At Blue Forest, we feel it's important to pursue not just one, but multiple benefits of restoration. So to carry out successful conservation finance model, we need to secure additional funding from non-traditional beneficiary payers. This is essential and relies on the ability to understand and quantify and communicate these diverse benefits that forest restoration can bring to us. We like to differentiate ourselves by quantifying benefits as actionable metrics, communicate them in salient terms, and we operate under two types of benefits. One are cornerstone benefits, which we have, and I'll walk you through some examples, have relatively mature scientific models that can communicate those values, and then also frontier benefits, these non-traditional benefits. Some of them are they're not market benefits like avoided emissions with carbons, yet biodiversity and other economic benefits. The beneficiaries we work with are many and varied. It could be power utilities, water agencies, corporate partners, with watershed conservation goals, and we've also had conversations with local agriculture and tourism groups. So as I mentioned, the Forest Resilience Bond, or the FRB, is our flagship financial product. I could give a whole talk on this, but I think I want to focus mostly on the right-hand side here. This is what, as a scientist, I think about and support with some of our work. If you talk to our investment team, they'll take you from the left side. I'm going to gloss over that a little bit, but the Forest Resilience Bond in the middle is where the funds are stored and deployed at the start of a project. So in thinking about first restoration activities, at Blue Forest, we don't plan these projects. We come in when there is the need for upfront capital or scientific support to make the case for these ecosystem benefits. And so starting at the restoration activities, because of permits already in place, we understand where the activities could happen and what types of activities they are in terms of fuels reduction and so forth. My job with the team that I work with at Blue Forest, our science team, is to quantify some of those benefits. And really, as a currency in a lot of different formats, economic units, biophysical units, avoided costs, we can waive those in front of beneficiaries. And ultimately, these are the payers of the model, the beneficiaries. They're the ones that are paying back the investors at their own time period. And because we have such a low interest rate on some of these products, there's not a lot of additional costs there. Another important piece is the land manager and the implementation partner. We work initially a lot on public lands, and so that's the Forest Service in terms of the land manager, and groups like the National Forest Foundation, which is a public-private group that can essentially help us implement some of these projects, these activities that produce these benefits and allow beneficiaries to realize them over time. When I first started at Blue Forest, I created this animation to show what's at stake in our first landscape, the watershed, the Yuba watershed. And you can see just how the fire history over the last 20 or 30 years is just surrounding and crowding out this area, including the Camp Fire, which we know affected the town of Paradise. And what's not even shown here is in 2021, the Caldor Fire just southeast of Lake Tahoe. And so it's showing that while there really hasn't been a major wildfire in that area, we can see what's at stake. And so we use that as an opportunity, and this is how Blue Forest works with different beneficiaries, including utilities. We're trying to understand what are their priorities and how they overlap with the land manager, in this case, the National Forest Service on public lands. We want to work with those staffs to assess and value project benefits of interest. And then we really want to be that broker to help utilities and land managers work together to get those priorities implemented. Our first Forest Resilience Bond project had a mixture of different forest restoration activities, which you can see here on the left. And the big beneficiary, without that beneficiary and that commitment in place, none of this goes. And so the big one was the Yuba Water Agency. They wanted to reduce wildfire risk in the watershed. They operate a reservoir at the bottom of the watershed, and so they were willing to dip their foot in first in 2018 with $4 million, and then since it's grown and expanded throughout the landscape. This is an animation of just that work that was initially catalyzed by the Yuba Water Agency and the FRB, and how it's expanded across this entire landscape and the North Yuba Forest Partnership. And as we approach 2026, we are making progress both in retreating some of the areas in new ecosystems like meadows in the Yuba 1 footprint there in the upper right, as well as expanding throughout the entire landscape. And so this pilot to scale model is really what we're going for. Pilot to demonstrate success, and then get others to come in that public-private partnership to be able to fund a lot of work. Recall my earlier slide about that big funding gap. There's a lot of benefits. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our cornerstone benefits, the water, as well as the fire risk reduction that really got this project started. One that was news to me as a non-hydrologist is how we can frame some of the benefits around water quantity. And the way we term it is acre feet of water. So if you have an acre of land, imagine that land of an acre is flooded by a 1 foot depth of water. That's how we measure volumetric water benefits. There was also hydropower production in addition to that water yield, avoided carbon emissions, sustaining local jobs, and increasing the local economic value in the area. And so you can see that initial contribution and how it's grown. They just agreed to another $6 million for the second Yuba project recently. I think feedback from partners really speaks to the ability of the Forest Resilience Bond to increase the pace and scale of this work. And so what I'm quoting here is one from a land manager and one from the beneficiary of the Yuba Water Agency. Lon Henderson here speaks to the fact that really these projects like Yuba would take over 10 years if it was just on the Forest Service and partners to work on it, and probably would never get implemented at all. And now they were able to complete it within 4 years. So that's that pace and scale benefit or success. And then from the Yuba Water Agency, that beneficiary, they really saw this as the foundation. This first project was the foundation for future large-scale work in the watershed, and we're seeing that, as you saw with the animation. So moving on to the second of 3 sections of my talk, I really want to show you how we measure benefits. Steph mentioned that at the start. I think it's important. I'm not going to get too much into the technical weeds, but I just want to show you how we can start to quantify some of these benefits from forest work and be able to share that, communicate that in ways that it resonates with these potential payers into the model, and using some science, some data, some tools, really exciting stuff. I'm going to start with water supply opportunity. That's that additional water quantity that we can realize from treating forests. Again, not as a forester, this was kind of news to me, but we think about thinning the forest, you're losing trees, and how does that increase water? Well, we know that these projects, these fuels reduction projects, have the ability to increase water availability, and some of those benefits can persist for 15 to 20 years before it goes back to the original state. And it's really rooted in this relationship between precipitation, evapotranspiration, and runoff, which is essentially that additional water supply. And evapotranspiration in this case is what we can control, okay? So, and then we can measure that change in evapotranspiration from treatment using proxies, in this case, satellite measured greenness index that helps us, that serves as a reliable predictor of evapotranspiration and changes in the Sierra Nevada region, and now we've expanded that model through the Western US. So again, in the sort of water cycle, and water balance, evapotranspiration is what we can control. And so we have maps like this that are these sort of the outputs of these very complex models that show us for different types of treatment, what are the additional benefits. And as you can see with this map, the darker blue means areas where if we were to apply the same treatment to that forest, how much additional water, acre feet of water per acre treated we would expect. Initially. And of course, that benefit decays over time as vegetation regrows, but these are the initial estimates, and we can estimate that benefit over 15 to 20 years, as you can see here. So for example, we're trying to essentially give these partners a sense for what is their return on investment in terms of additional water volume. And it can be very compelling to not just locals, but also corporations that have sort of water stewardship goals and offsets and things like that, to be able to market some of these projects. We can speak to a utility like one in the Lake Tahoe area around each individual project that has been already planned and permitted. What is the additional water contribution from that project, as well as what is the rate? And we have different scenarios of treatment that we can then match to these planned projects. We know what that design scenario looks like, and then we can give very precise estimates on the additional amount of water that comes from that. And these differences are driven by things like location and the types of treatments that are being prescribed for the area. Moving on to water quality. This, as we've talked about, and we talked a lot about at dinner last night, is really driven by wildfire. And so fire fundamentally alters how water moves in the landscape. You can see from the diagram, if we have this high severity fire on the right, minimal absorption, mostly excess runoff and sedimentation. When it does rain, less water is absorbed by the watershed and more is converted into runoff, in turn leading to that increased erosion, that hydrophobic soil that was mentioned earlier. In the big picture, these hazards range from loss of life to impaired water quality to significant infrastructure damage. And again, you can see that difference between a high or moderate burn severity and the cascading hazards that go down to the downstream communities, compared to on the right, the low burn severity, where you have sort of a normal functioning landscape. At the top of the watershed, this is what you're seeing here, loss of canopy and ground cover following the fire, leading to erosion and sedimentation. When that moves to the hill slopes to channels, that sediment accumulates and can prime conditions for debris flows. And then, we talked about this a lot yesterday, unfortunately, during the summer, after fire season, or during fire season, you get these large summer storms with lots of rain, intense rainfall, and that's where we're getting these catastrophic floods and debris flows. And then we know what the downstream consequences are to communities in terms of flooding and damages, but there's also some of these hidden insidious agents. If we're working at the wildland-urban interface, chemicals, benzene, organic carcinogens, toxic metals, even fire retardants that are being used to put out these fires, all of that's ending up and affecting the aquatic ecology and more. So at Blue Forest, this is a complex, wicked problem in itself, trying to understand what are the benefits of reducing wildfire risk and how we can manage. So the first thing we're trying to do is really understand the difference between pre-fire and post-fire in current conditions. What is the sediment volume following that wildfire? And we're challenged by a few things. One thing I wanted to point out again in that Lake Tahoe landscape that we've been working in, we have this sort of good news, bad news situation. The good news is there hasn't been a high severity fire. And the bad news is that doesn't give us a lot of data on what we can expect in terms of these impacts following a fire and all those other hazards that I just talked about. Models, a lot of the models, as we were talking with some of our science advisors yesterday, around sedimentation are very limited, and some are really just not embraced by the scientific community. So working on fine-tuning some of those models and focusing on particular impacts that we can accurately measure and reducing some of that uncertainty. And then ultimately what we're trying to do is quantify those impacts to reservoirs, to water-related infrastructure. And the idea is if we can lower the probability of burning, we can lower some of these costs. And we're fortunate enough to have a new water quality scientist who's really helping us think about that and working with colleagues at Vibrant Planet and others who also are starting to develop tools for this. The last cornerstone benefit and most relevant to this group is around community protection, landscape resilience, and wildfire risk reduction. At Blue Forest, we've started thinking about it in terms of how we can monetize some of these benefits around asset and liability risk reduction. And so with asset risk reduction, we're thinking about for a given community, what are the assets, what are they worth, and what is the difference in terms of extent and probability of damages in a pre versus post-treatment scenario. Liability is an interesting one. It's not about your assets. It's about you potentially igniting a wildfire, and then as a utility, and what are the impacts to neighboring timberlands or other infrastructure. And we've seen some of these huge settlements around utilities in the Pacific Northwest that have had to settle for billions of dollars because they had burned, productive, high-value timberlands in Oregon and so forth. I want to walk you through one example of an asset risk reduction analysis that the group called Pyrologics, now under the Vibrant Planet umbrella that Kat works with, provided to us. Very targeted pre versus post-treatment wildfire modeling that was able to make the case to a beneficiary to support our first FRB in the state of Washington. And so the outputs show, as I'll show you in some cool animations, an 80% decrease in acres that would burn at high intensity. Again, that reduction in high severity wildfire. Here are some of the players, similar activities, also looking at some aquatic organism passages with some of the forest treatments, and really trying to get that beneficiary Chelan Public Utility District to be able to contribute to the Forest Resilience Bond that was launched. Here are some of the animations from Pyrologics, sort of world-class in terms of the fire modeling, showing the areas that are treated and what is the change in 30-year burn probability. Similarly, that probability of crown fires, sort of that fuel regime, how that is changing. And we use a threshold of 8 feet, which is generally known in terms of transmission lines that cause extensive damages, in terms of changes in burn intensity and the probability of crown fire. And this is really what was needed to convince that county public utility district to get involved with the forest resilience bond. So you can see them there. Here are some of the outcomes that are anticipated or estimated with the benefit evaluation that we did as part of the projects. So as I mentioned, wildfire risk reduction, additional acre feet of water from reduced evapotranspiration, jobs sustained, and other work being catalyzed in the area. So that concludes the second piece, and now I want to really tee up, I think, some of the bioeconomy work for this panel here. At Blue Forest, we doubled the amount of FRBs that we've had just this year. So in January of this year, we were at 6, and to date now we've launched 10, so just about a doubling. And that includes some projects that are in development in Colorado, so mostly focused in the Pacific Northwest, moving to Colorado, and also looking at Montana. I think the big thing to start off with is we started on public lands managed by the U.S. Forest Service, and now we have a few resilience bonds that are working on private lands as well as tribal lands, including the first one of a tribally led workforce and on tribal lands in Northern California. The last piece of my talk focus is in on the Blue Forest umbrella is not just about conservation finance and the forest resilience bond. It's also about a new asset management company that we have within Blue Forest. And so just a warning, this is a scientist talking to you about finance now. But really, Blue Forest asset management focuses on advancing the restoration economy. And so this is how we at Blue Forest think about investing in the forestry supply chain at a strategic level. We're trying to invest in every part of the forestry value chain, including hauling, processing, utilizing that biomass. Once it's pulled out of the forest, it's got to go somewhere. We don't want to be just slashing and burning. And we were in a productive forest, El Dorado National Forest, on a site visit a couple of years ago, and the forester said, this is a healthy, growing forest, and we would have to keep up with the amount of biomass that's accumulating, we would have to have 100 of those huge timber trucks every day pulling out that much wood, woody biomass. So it's a real problem. And so investing in these different parts of the forestry value chain is really important and very much aligned with some of the conservation finance and forest resilience bond objectives that I mentioned to you. So this is our attempt to take a strategic or systems level approach to ecosystem restoration, and direct supply chain investments are just one part of this multi-strategy approach. We also have financial products and services that are backed by our investment team, and would love to connect you with those individuals for those who are interested. Also under Blue Forest Asset Management is the California Wildfire Innovation Fund. And this really targets competitive financial returns alongside impact returns. So those impact returns are these groups, these investors that are investing in some of our financial products, not expecting a huge return on their investment, but rather the impact of the mission of that particular FRB or other project is aligned with their mission. But we also are focused on competitive financial returns. And so these investments include wood processing facilities and forestry services and tech companies. And you can see the portfolio of impact to date from CWIF is very much aligned with some of those FRB objectives that we mentioned before of hazardous fuel removal, workforce development, jobs sustained, and additional funds, including making public dollars go further through this financing vehicle. So my last two slides, I just want to acknowledge that in addition to the cornerstone benefits that I shared with you, we also have what we call frontier benefits. These are ones that are non-market goods often, or soon to be market goods, and we have a lot of work to do. biodiversity, for example, we've worked with utilities in California that are interested in salmon and river health objectives, but more research and fundraising is needed to really see where that could fit in as part of that benefit stack for innovative finance. On the carbon side, my colleague Micah Elias is really leading the charge there, and the California Wildfire Innovation Fund was really built on the back of his PhD work at Berkeley. And what he's trying to do is rethink how management can change the structure of the forest and change the severity of fire. And so on the avoided emissions or wildfire emissions and credit side, as Kat mentioned, we're contributing to some of the Vera protocols, and then biomass utilization. As we know, we're removing a lot from the forest, as I mentioned, and I'm thinking about what Nick had said on the first day of this symposium. It doesn't have clear pathways to market. And so how can we take that feedstock supply, those raw materials coming off the forest? It's not just trees, it's other materials. And that wood basket, thanks again to the School of Design for some of these beautiful visuals from my colleague Micah's paper. That wood basket is really sort of the frontier for us. At the top, Micah and colleagues found that 2 rounds of treatment, thinning and prescribed fire, will actually yield more carbon stock per acre and avoided emissions, meaning no wildfire, than an untreated forest, that sort of increased carbon stability that Kat had mentioned earlier. And then in terms of biomass utilization, as we move down the chain, there's at the top of the wood basket, those most valuable saw timber trees, 2x4s, plywood, that represents mercantile timber. We have the middle of the basket, the medium trees that some mills can take, and then the bottom, these small diameter trees and poles used for bioenergy and other markets, including biochar and other viable biomass utilization options. But we still have some questions about these at the bottom. How to talk about them? Is there infrastructure to leverage and utilize them? What are their emissions profiles? How can we catalyze investment into these different supply chains? So as Micah told me, each piece of the wood basket has to be thought of as interrelated but different because of the products that they make and the industry that they support. Last slide, I promise. So at Blue Forest, we're expanding to new geographies and ecosystem types, developing tools for carbon and biodiversity, and advancing partnerships with utilities, corporations, government, tribes to help us scale conservation finance. We're looking forward to the future, working with individuals in this room and other organizations. And I just want to thank you for your time and look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Greg. I think you teed us up perfectly for our next speaker. So I'm pleased to introduce Evan Schmidt. He's the Senior Program Manager for Wood Markets at Sustainable Northwest, a Pacific Northwest-based nonprofit. Evan's work focuses on market-based innovations that support forest and community health. Prior to SNW, Evan worked at Oregon State University and at the Tallwood Design Institute in applied mass timber research. Evan holds a bachelor's degree in architecture and a master's degree in wood science. So I'd like to welcome Evan to talk a little bit more about that diverse wood basket and all the great work you guys are doing.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thanks for being here and listening to my talk and for the introduction. Just to iterate on that, Evan Schmidt, quick background beyond what was covered, architecture, wood science, spent a better part of a decade working in applied mass timber research. So my expertise really kind of lies in wood products specifically. And I'm going to cover this a little bit later in the talk, but one of the reasons that I ended up moving to Sustainable Northwest, which was about maybe 1.5, 2 years ago, was while I was working in the mass timber space at Tallwood Design Institute at Oregon State, a lot of my work was essentially kind of like extension work bridging to the architectural engineering and construction communities. And what I found really fascinating about mass timber was this sort of forest to frame narrative which is sort of analogous to the farm to table movement, right? Knowing where your things come from and the sort of the interest that generates in the design community, I felt like in a very tangible way started shifting perceptions and narratives around wood products specifically, and kind of moving it out of a almost exclusively contentious or at least very polarized space into a space where the idea that wood products could be sustainable or regenerative really had that sort of fertile soil on which to grow. And that's great, but along with it, a lot of questions from architects, other designers, developers, landowners about wood. Who owns and manages forests? Are the practices of management good? So on and so forth, right? So that's going to be kind of the backbone of this conversation. I was asked to speak a little bit to, what are the challenges in terms of scaling the bioeconomy from a wood products or wood markets perspective, and what kind of opportunities are there? And then I was banging my head trying to figure out how to do that in 15 minutes to 20 minutes. So I'll do my best. But that's the backbone, and I want to get back to that forest frame concept kind of towards the end of this talk. So, we've been talking a lot about management, right, with specific outcomes in mind, specifically restoration, wildfire risk reduction, severity reduction, and obviously there are all these kind of approaches to how do you scale the bioeconomy from a policy, from a finance, all these different sort of perspectives. I work in the wood markets group. So the lens that I essentially have to think through is through this market-based perspective. How do markets play a role in scaling restoration? And I think there's really kind of three core pillars, right? It's like a three-legged stool. You need your markets. You need those demand drivers that basically say, we specifically want what you're selling, right? You need the milling and the manufacturing, whether it's a biomass product or it's a long-lived wood product, and then you actually need the active management. And without either of those three things, then you really kind of have a dysfunctional stool. It's hard to sit on a two-legged stool, but if you've got good core strength, you really can. So, okay, I just love these old-timey pictures. They feel kind of cheesy to incorporate, but just look at those guys, you know what I'm saying? And I was like, well, why include this? I was like, well, to kind of give some context to what we're talking about. I always think it's kind of interesting to look back, and it's like, a bunch of what look like 45-year-old dudes that are probably all 13 or 14 years old, child labor. And obviously, they're sitting maybe proudly next to this giant old growth log that they've got on a choo-choo train. And but I do feel like this kind of like betrays the sort of the origins of the ethos of the wood products industry, right? Which was this sort of like it's this gold rush, particularly into the West, of what was essentially considered unclaimed magical resources that whoever got to it first, it was theirs. And so it was this sort of panacea. And the industry also kind of reflected that to a degree, right? So the industry was pretty disparate, decentralized, different, relatively rudimentary technologies. A lot of mills were powered by streams, things like that. And then, primarily producing rough sawn heavy timbers and dimension lumber. And then I had to focus in on this guy too. I promise I won't zoom in on people anymore in this presentation. But I was like, I guess this guy's running the mill. And I was like, he's wearing a pinstripe suit. So I'm pretty sure, and he looks grumpy. So I was like, I'm pretty sure this is like a lumber baron inspecting the machinery and he's not actually working. So yeah, I mean, and if we kind of like try to map the trajectory, right? Like what has happened since then? And that's too big for me to cover, and that's not my expertise. But I think one way to think about it is how have things sort of gelled, right? And we can look at that through the lens of the forests and through the lens of the wood products industry. And even just on the forest side, right? Like ownership is complex and has kind of evolved, but also gelled. This is a map of Oregon. I would say this is itself even sort of oversimplified, but we've got our kind of classic buckets of federal, BLM, U.S. Forest Service, which make up the vast percentage in Oregon. large private, which I would say is a blend, but I'm just going to call it industrial for this sake. Small private, maybe we say those are like family forests, state, tribal, and then other public, which I'm assuming is probably like community forests and things like that. And what's interesting is the vast majority of industrial ownership resides in those really productive coastal valley and then Western Cascade forests, right? I mean, that's the bulk majority of industrial ownership, and they account for 2/3 of all the commercial output in the state. And there are all sorts of reasons for this. I think it's worth mentioning, right? Like part of this trajectory relates to the challenges that we face when we're trying to scale a restoration bioeconomy, which is a lot of this land was bought up in response to the desire for stable fiber supply. And with the advent of the Northwest Forest Plan in the 90s and the spotted owl, and a 90% reduction in fiber coming off of federal forest, which up to that point had been managed essentially as timber hubs for mills, that resulted in another huge consolidation of the industry, not dissimilar from what Prohibition did to beer, by the way. There was like 10,000 breweries in the country before Prohibition, and then after that, it was when Anheuser-Busch and Coors and all these companies became barons, right? So there's a little bit of an analog of like what we've seen in terms of the consolidation of the industry. It's not just because of the Northwest Forest Plan. There's all sorts of factors, right? Technology, where do people live, transportation hubs. But again, just kind of digging into this, I think it's interesting. If you look at the dominant commercial forest types, you'll notice a few things, one of which that no single hardwood, at least that I remember. No, you got red alder at 2%, so excuse me. Very limited hardwood production there, right? And Doug fir in Oregon accounts for 71%, at least in 2017, of commercial harvest. And you'll notice that there's also a close alignment with where the bulk majority of industrial ownership and production resides. So not only is 2/3 of all of the commercial production happening essentially in that band, but another 3/4 of that is specifically probably just Doug fir. And so where the industry has kind of gone is again kind of towards this consolidation, and it means that the way that we're able to manage a diversity of forests through the market is pretty limited. And the industry, I feel like they like to make a lot of assertions as to the difficulties that are faced from a regulatory standpoint or so on and so forth. But there are so many factors here that coalesce that it's difficult to really make any sort of comprehensive judgment. One thing I do think we can really say is that automation and technology have had huge impacts in terms of the way our mills, for instance, work. So if you go to the average modern mill that's at least moderate capacity, it is not unreasonable to estimate a couple 100,000 board feet of production a day or even a shift. I was just in a mill in Northern California that produces 500,000 board feet a shift. And then you walk through the mill and you see 10 people the entire time you're there inside of the mill. And then maybe more people on forklifts and whatnot outside of the mill. So you've got this consolidation into really big mills that are producing insane amounts of wood, and then you're seeing small mills all over the country close in these regions that we're talking about. And then they're also tooling and optimizing towards logs that speak to short rotations, right? And so their sweet spot is like 8 to 14 or 16-inch logs, and everything is automated and tooled to those sizes, to the point now where there aren't that many mills that can handle even larger logs that you might perchance desire if you're interested in extended rotation forestry practices, right? So we've talked to mills in our line of work where our landowners, like we've talked to Port Blakely, they manage extended rotation. And they're like, we have 5 mills that can buy from us. If a single one of those mills goes out of business, we have to change from long rotation to like standard short rotation length. And then those mills say the same thing. If we saw any decline in fiber of larger logs, we would literally shut down. So right, the fate is kind of hanging in this balance. But again, what we're seeing with industry is it's kind of everything is moving towards standardization, optimization. And there's a sort of a tension there, I think, with what we're talking about when we're thinking about how markets can play a role in finding economic value for the byproduct of restoration. This is kind of a chaotic slide, I'm realizing. just going to not say anything and let people digest it and like come to their own conclusions. Like, what the heck is this? Ponderosa pine, that's a diagram of its sort of range, habitat range. It's one of the more ubiquitous species across the American West. And then I've kind of highlighted here some recent fires out in Eastern Oregon alongside mill closures in the region. And so again, this is just a highlight. We're seeing infrastructure decrease in these regions that are dry forest, overstocked, prone to fire, and that really stand to benefit the most from the presence of that infrastructure. And so I'll just let that, I won't build on that anymore for now, but that is a kind of a critical piece here, right? And ponderosa pine, part of the reason I include that is there's all this interest in, hey, are there better economic outlets for this other than windows and doors? I mean, even Geldwin down in the Klamath Basin, who is a major purveyor of ponderosa pine, they've closed down facilities, right? So a big part of this conversation that everyone in the industry and in government and in nonprofit, when it comes to the market side, is utilization of underutilized species or low value feedstocks, including small diameter. It's not just small diameter. There are species out there that don't have much market, particularly hardwoods over here in the West, or over there in the West, and so on. I know. And so again, like what does the industry say why this is a big deal? Well, I think in some cases there's recognition that a lot of these small mills don't have the capital assets to invest in the kind of technologies that they need to compete at scale. There are constant comments about the predictability and availability of fiber supply. Workforce is something that always comes up. It's usually in the form of nobody wants to work these days, which I always laugh at. But you know, it's a difficult thing. These kind of jobs, whether in forestry or in mills, used to be pretty high-paying middle-class jobs, and they're just not anymore. And I feel like that culturally has not sunk in. Where it's like, yeah, the housing out in that rural area you live in is totally unaffordable somehow, and your jobs don't. Who wants to work in a mill for 12 hours for $17.10 an hour, you know? And then finally, it's back to the market side, where you need those outlets, whether it's biomass markets or it's long-lived wood products or what may it be, you need that throughput. And again, this is always kind of like what captures it for me. This is the nut everybody's trying to crack. What do we do with this stuff? And how do we grow this ecosystem that we know we need to sort of create these market systems that actually support this at scale? And I feel like these are the two that I kind of crop up the most, right? It's like biochar comes up a lot, and then mass timbers come up a lot. I can't even remember how much time I have, so when I start going way over, somebody just yell at me. But you know, cross-laminated timber, I'm assuming everybody here is familiar with that. It's been sort of the poster child of the mass timber movement. It's great. I don't think it's the end-all be-all. It has wonderful applications and promise. One of those promises has historically been, well, look, you can use lower-grade fiber in the interior layers. In practice, that's not really done because of manufacturing logistics, amongst other reasons. And then the species that could potentially go into ponderosa or into cross-laminated timber are somewhat limited by the standard that defines how it's made, PRG 320. I mean, in order to certify a new layup, every single facility, it's like a product-specific certification, has to be probably looking at 70 grand minimum to certify a new layup at a facility. So there's not a lot of motivation to go outside of the box for these manufacturers. There are some really interesting stories that I think are worth sharing. They're kind of random, but not. One is Western juniper. I think this is a really fascinating story in terms of sort of representing what is the potential of a market-based solution in the kind of conversations we're having. Western juniper, you know, relatively widespread throughout the sort of more arid, high desert regions in the American West. And due to fire suppression, it's become something akin to a native invasive. So you can see even just, here's one of those little granular time warps, 45 years. These things grow really fast. Well, what's the problem? Huge impacts on the terrestrial ecosystem. I can't remember who was saying, somebody was talking about how quickly they burn, right? So it's this other sort of additional risk for the wildland-urban interface. And then they also are super thirsty. So they deplete streams and affect riparian fish habitat. And up to this point, or up to not too long ago, there was no real consensus or decision, how do you deal with this? And at some point, a sort of a coalition of folks said, well, like, what can we do with this? Starting from zero. It's not great wood. We're pretty much certain it's not gonna have good structural capacity. It's super twisty, it has huge resin pockets. Like, it's just not great. But it turns out that it's incredibly durable. And so through research, it was determined the heartwood of juniper is more durable than cedar or redwood. And so that kind of spurred this initiative to, instead of subsidizing ranchers through tax dollars to cut down and burn or pile or mulch or whatever with the juniper on their land, that we could actually make these connections within the market to sawmills and start selling this to people who want to use it as cladding, decking, siding, fencing, garden beds. And it's been successful. I mean, as of what I last checked, 100,000 acres of western juniper removed annually, 10 sawmills that were being worked with, 4 million board feet produced annually as well. And this is the Nature Conservancy's headquarters in Portland, Oregon, who use it as their siding and decking. Another one related to the mountain pine beetle, blue stain, formerly totally undesirable. This wood would have been considered garbage. And then some clever marketer started calling it denim wood. And then people were like, yeah, that's cool. And so only reason I bring this up is, you know, a lot of what we're talking about, at least on the sort of the consumer market side, comes back to education and perceptions, right? And awareness. So like when you make this procurement decision or specification decision, it translates to these outcomes back on the landscape. In terms of mass timber, I'm particularly excited by these two products. Much simpler than cross-laminated timber, resin-free. You got nail laminated timber on the left, dowel laminated timber on the right. It's literally just dimension lumber that's been nailed or doweled together. And it's awesome. At risk of nerding out on this too long, what excites me about it is the overhead for opening up a manufacturing facility significantly lower than, say, like a Smart Lam or somebody producing cross-laminated timber, one. With nail laminated timber, you don't even need a facility. A contractor can make it on site. Two. What does that mean? Well, because these don't adhere to the same standard that CLT or mass ply, for instance, adheres to, you can actually spec these through the building code. There are some caveats there I won't get into. But what that translates to is, as long as there are design values for a species and grade in the National Design Specification that AWC publishes, you can use that wood in these products, which is not the case for CLT. So with nail laminated timber, for instance, again, you can just make it on site. This was the production of the nail laminated timber for the Candida building at Georgia Institute for Technology. They were originally going to go with dowel laminated timber. They decided to go nail laminated timber. This was a living building challenge certified project. So all the 2x6 was FSC certified, and then all the material between that was random length reclaimed 2x4 from deconstruction. So that just kind of points to, again, like the inputs you can use for this are more flexible. And if you can produce it on site, that means you can produce it from any mill that's adjacent to you. You're not necessarily relying on, if you want to do mass timber, for instance, that you need to go to ship lumber to Smart Lam in Montana, for instance, right? And then, recovery for lumber is pretty low. It's like 50 or 60%. It's better for plywood with veneer. And so you've got all these residuals, and I feel like this got touched on a little bit, but you kind of have to use the whole turkey for it to work, right? Like the wood products economy depends on every single thing being used for it to pencil out. And what we've seen is the collapse of pulp and paper markets domestically have translated in itself to mill closures. And so, thinking about other secondary products that speak to sort of making the entire ecosystem whole is an important part of the conversation. This is Timber HP, they're out in Maine, using residuals from lumber production to make wood fiber insulation. And I feel like I'm probably, I need to go, yeah. Sorry, guys. Yeah, so I'll zip through these. I think like coming back to where I started, this is really important, right? Like, and back to the topic of ecosystem services and how do we begin to value those? That's gonna be importantly quantitative, and it's also importantly qualitative. The recognition within the marketplace of those values is a critical component to starting that pathway of making those purposeful decisions to support the types of forestry that need to be supported. And so here's my version of the classic beehive of values. We can skip through that. Part of the problem with that, as of right now in the wood product supply chain, is it's incredibly opaque. It has never been designed to be comprehensible. And it is extremely difficult if you get a wood product, generally speaking, to even tether it back to a mill. I mean, if you get a piece of lumber, you get a mill stamp, and if you know what that means, you can do something with it maybe. Beyond that, impossible, pretty much. Even if you're getting FSC certified wood, you don't know where that wood's coming from. You don't know what country the wood's coming from. So a lot of our work is very specifically oriented towards just building transparency within the wood product supply chain under the pretense that without that fundamental transparency, you don't have the mechanisms with which to tie the values that the forestry that's going into the products that you're buying. You just don't have that, right? So transparency is a foundational component. This is the Portland Airport project. It's been a little bit beaten to death, but it's a really amazing and interesting story where the project was originally going to go FSC, millions of board feet, pretty much was going to be impossible in terms of getting that volume. And the client, the Port of Portland, basically said, well, what else can we do? And the process became, well, what are you trying to, why do you want FSC certified wood? And that process evolved into working with the entirety of the supply chain, a bunch of landowners directly, and then basically saying, well, look, now we're sourcing from multiple tribes in the region, we're sourcing from small family forests, climate smart wood, restoration projects, and that became such a more powerful story than just saying we bought 2 million board feet of FSC. And so, for the sake of everybody's time, I won't get too deep into my 1980s PowerPoint slide here. But the piece on the right I will point to, U.S. Green Building Council, LEED V5, Living Future with Living Building Challenge. Numerous of these organizations are beginning to adopt these multi-attribute frameworks that speak back again to these sort of ecosystem services, right? The values that are externalized in the marketplace or the costs that are externalized in the marketplace. And so I do think that looking forward is an exciting prospect in terms of the market systems attempting to begin to bake some of these things in. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. And last but not least, we have Dylan Williams. He's the Wildfire Mitigation Program Coordinator for Douglas County, Colorado. Previously worked for 8 years with the City of Boulder's Open Space and Mountain Parks as Forest Ecosystem Management Program Lead and a wildland firefighter. He holds BS in Natural Resource Conservation from the University of Kentucky and has dedicated his career to forest and wildfire management. Thank you so much, Dylan.
Good afternoon. My name is Dylan Williams, and I serve as the Wildfire Mitigation and Resilience Coordinator for Douglas County. Today I'll be speaking on aligning fuels reduction and forest bioeconomy, challenges and opportunities on Colorado's Front Range. So this is a map of from our wildfire risk assessment tool showing potential fire behavior. Wildfire risk is growing and forcing our hand in how we must manage our forests. The red on this map shows the highest fire danger, and it basically outlines the Rocky Mountains through Colorado. So Douglas County is right there in between Denver and Colorado Springs, right on the edge of the foothills and right in that high fire danger area. So our county covers about 843 square miles. It's halfway between Denver and Colorado Springs and the two biggest population hubs in Colorado. About a third of the county is covered by the Pike National Forest. And fuel types vary widely in the county. We've got eastern plains and then lowland scrub oak leading up to the foothills, transitioning to ponderosa pine, and at higher elevations, mixed conifer, and our population is rapidly growing. It's 400,000 right now, projected to increase by 2.5% over the next 20 years. And that just means that more people are living closer to the wildland-urban interface, and that significantly increases exposure and wildfire risk. About 10% of Colorado's 24 million forested acres are in urgent need of treatment to address forest health, reduce wildfire risk, and protect water supplies. But that's far less expensive than the alternative, which in a worst-case scenario, taxpayers and residents could be on the hook for 13 times that amount due to property loss and loss of economic development. As we look at the Upper South Platte watershed on this map, it's important to remember that fuels reduction isn't just about reducing fire intensity, as we've heard from a lot of the other presenters, but fundamentally about protecting the broader ecosystem functions. This watershed depends on these functions, and the 3 million people that are in the Denver metro area use this watershed for drinking water. It supports healthy riparian systems, which regulate water temperature, provide habitat, buffer peak flows, and by restoring a more natural forest structure and species composition, we improve biodiversity and long-term resilience. All these functions are interconnected, and when we mitigate strategically, we're not just reducing fuels, we're reinforcing the ecological processes that keep that watershed productive, stable, and resilient. So this is one of those photos. This is one of the project areas. Pre-treatment, it's a mixed conifer stand at around 8,000 feet elevation. It's ponderosa pine, Doug fir, and Rocky Mountain juniper. Conditions are extremely dense, basically no fuel breaks in horizontal or vertical continuity. This is pretty typical of how a lot of the Front Range forests looked after 100 years of wildfire suppression. Lots of fuel, lots of ladder fuel, and a structure that really just favors high severity stand replacing fires. This is that exact same stand post-treatment. Good canopy spacing, reduction in continuity, and a more mosaic pattern of vegetation on the landscape. The material that we remove in Colorado is mostly small diameter, low value timber. And that's really one of the defining characteristics and differences between Colorado's Front Range forests and forests that are further west. Our forests are made up of just a handful of tree species, mostly ponderosa pine at low elevation, and a mix of Doug fir, aspen, lodgepole, and ponderosa higher up. The combination and composition of semi-arid climate means that historically, these forests experienced a frequent low-intensity fire regime, so every decade or two. And after that century of fire suppression, these forests have become dense and overstocked and drive the severe wildfire that we're seeing more and more often. So compared to the dense, high-volume forests of the Pacific Northwest, the Front Range is drier, less productive, and produces smaller diameter wood. That means our restoration work isn't about recovering commercial timber yields. That's about reducing wildfire risk and restoring resilience. And because the material that we are removing is low value and costly to transport, we have to find new value streams to increase the scope and scale of our projects. In short, building restoration bioeconomy in Colorado and across the interior West will look fundamentally different than in coastal timber regions. It's got to be smarter, leaner, and rooted to local innovation. So we consistently run into 4 key limitations when we're trying to scale fuel reduction: limited workforce capacity, fragmented land ownership, insufficient biomass processing capacity, and funding and market constraints. Each of these creates delays or adds costs, and together they limit how much work we can realistically get done on the ground each year. After evaluating where we could have the greatest impact, we identified biomass processing as the most effective point of focus, and improving the ability to receive these, sort, and utilize this small diameter, low value wood doesn't just remove a major operational bottleneck, but it lowers project costs, it supports contractor viability, and it makes long-term fuels work more scalable across the Front Range. So traditionally, the options for biomass disposal, one was taking it to sawmills. But in Colorado, in 1982, we had 84 sawmills in the state. By 2002, that number had decreased to 50 sawmills. Between 2002 and 2007, it declined to 30 sawmills. And then in 2020, the number of sawmills was at 27. So that just means that the sawmills are able to be very selective in the wood that they accept, and that they're easily overwhelmed, especially with all of the new funding that's going into to these fuels reduction projects. The other option in Colorado is creating burn piles, but that has its own challenges: limited windows, required air quality permits, staffing challenges. Most of our burns occur during the winter, which is when a lot of these seasonal employees are laid off. Safety, steep terrain, and it just leaves fuel on the landscape. We have tens of thousands of these piles that are on our public lands right now that are just there as fuel for fires, and they're also just decomposing into the ground. And then the last and probably the least desirable is landfills and sort yards. It's really expensive to transport and dump into landfills. It also just takes up space for other refuse that has no other option but to go into a landfill. And then sort yards, more and more people are just getting away from burning wood as a source of heat. So our solution was to create biochar. We wanted to turn this low-value wood into something that had value. So in July of this year, after over a year and a half of project planning, the Board of County Commissioners approved funding for a biochar facility in Douglas County. So what is biochar? Biochar is a carbon-rich material created by heating wood or other organic matter in a low oxygen environment, a process called pyrolysis. Instead of burning biomass, releasing its carbon in the atmosphere, pyrolysis converts it into a stable form that can last for centuries in soil. The simple process turns low-value forest waste into a valuable product that can help reduce wildfire risk, improve soil structure and water retention, and it can even capture contaminants such as heavy metals, pesticides, organic pollutants from soil and water. So biochar for us represents a proven, scalable solution that links forest restoration, climate mitigation, land health, and local economic development. So by producing biochar, we're not just mitigating wildfire risk, we're creating a product with a range of additional benefits. Really what we're focused on is agricultural biochar, which is put into the soil to increase water retention and enhancing soil structure, making nutrients easier accessible. It provides long-term carbon sequestration and potential access to the carbon credit market. It can be used in mine reclamation. In Colorado, we have a ton of uncapped mines that are in need of reclamation, and it can help filter contaminants in water systems. And it also improves stormwater management. We've got partners in Aurora Water and Denver Water that are really excited about the potential here. So locating a processing facility of liability biomass proximal to sources of the material reduces the project costs for all of those projects, allowing the same amount of funding to handle more projects, thereby stretching available dollars and reducing risk at a faster pace. So this is the actual pyrolyzer unit that we've purchased, and our facility will be co-located with a composting service as well, so that biochar can be incorporated into the compost. This allows us to accept all forms of green waste, because for uniform feedstock, we have to, the pyrolysis unit will really only be accepting logs. But we're offering this as a community service, so we wanted to be able to take leaves, needles, branches, slash from HOAs, private land, as well as contractors and our Forest Service and State Forest Service partners. So this is just a little bit about what we'll be able to process. So our unit is able to process 1.5 tons of biomass per hour. That's 12,500 tons of biomass per year. And that yields about 12,500 cubic yards of biochar. We only purchased one unit for now, but the facility is being built large enough to house additional unit if the feedstock allows. We weren't really able to secure concrete numbers from the Forest Service or any of the contractors. No one wanted to promise us anything, but we think that, you know, we probably have somewhere between 50 and 100,000 tons that we would be able to process eventually. So who is buying biochar currently? Mostly it's landscape supply or specialty soil supply yards. Biochar is used as a replacement for peat, since peat is increasingly difficult to source and decomposes, so it requires ongoing applications. Biochar resists decomposition for decades or centuries and continues to provide benefits after years of a single application. We also have interest in partnerships with some of our wastewater management facilities in the area, stormwater management, and possibly filtration applications eventually. So in Douglas County, some of our strongest success stories come from the collaborative side of the work. We've seen a real impact through cross-boundary partnerships where agencies, landowners, and local governments align treatments at the landscape scale. And our education and outreach efforts have been critical. You know, just getting the residents the education and letting them understand the risk preparedness and value of mitigation. And we also run a cost share program where we cover 50% of the cost of defensible space efforts. That's what you're seeing on the right-hand side of the screen, before and after, for home ignition zone work that the cost share program is paid for. And And finally, we've got a mix of top-down and bottom-up approaches. So top-down, we have a regulatory aspect requiring all new builds, any new permit that's pulled to complete this defensible space, and as well as using fire-safe building materials. And then that bottom up is the education outreach, the cost share program, and working with all of our partners to create a unified strategy. What we hope to, what we're focused on is offsetting costs with our biochar program, developing a sustainable model that can operate beyond short-term grants, and ultimately create a blueprint for future projects going forward, especially in these low-value timber regions. So that's the path that we're working towards by tackling fuels, building partnerships, and engaging communities. We're reducing wildfire risk before the smoke hits. One strategy, shared resilience. And this is just a QR code for if you want to follow our progress here going forward. Thank you.
So I guess to kick things off, just one observation. First of all, thank you all for your presentations. It's so interesting seeing them all together. They're each really different views of what the bioeconomy entails. I feel like I often hear sort of conversations of like the economic models and ecosystem services quite separate from these larger conversations of either the wood products industry or what's happening in terms of land management and kind of municipal and government projects. So it's really nice to see all of that work together. And thank you for bringing all those case studies. I think when we often are talking about kind of, as we were this morning, sort of quote unquote scale of the problem or the specter of climate change and fire, and speaking from these, really intense spaces, folks are always asking about, the how do you make it scale type question. And I think just listening to your presentations today, I think you, in different ways, especially the last two presentations, talked about ways in which land management, consolidation, industrial production actually has scaled to a point in which some of the pieces of that relational ecosystem have broken, right? That the scaling itself has sort of made this whole system rather brittle. So I was wondering if you all could talk a little bit about, or think about, one piece of that system that you wish were better supported or better resourced. Who is sort of the actor in the puzzle that isn't getting enough love, whether it's economic or regulatory, et cetera, because I think in all senses for most folks, the overall bioeconomy, the fiber shed, the wood basket, whatever we call it, most of us don't really understand how all the pieces fit together or really see, who's quote unquote doing the work, who's paying for the work, or who are the beneficiaries, as you were calling them. So who is like missing right now from your all's perspective? I don't know who wants to take that?
Well, I think in Colorado, the biggest bottleneck that we see is in that private sector, workforce, transportation especially. There's without the timber industry present to drive the transportation and the sawmills, it's just not there, and that's kind of the piece of the puzzle next that I'm trying to solve. I don't know if that looks like grant funding to get places started. Hopefully by having and providing an outlet for all of this wood, will drive by necessity some of these transportation, but really that's the biggest hurdle for us in Colorado.
Go ahead, yeah.
I mean, I think what you guys are doing, I would almost point to what you guys are doing. I feel like I'm really excited by these public-private partnerships, and I feel like there's a ton of potential in the public playing a more active role within the wood market space, which feels like, there's been a century plus of the concept of state-owned infrastructure being sort of the boogeyman of the capitalist system we live within, right? And with anything, we've seen the push away from publicly owned utilities and so on and so forth. But it seems like there's a reason that the public can play a very important role in certain industries that are critical, right? And that the market isn't ready to respond to. So from my position, maybe ironically, I feel like we can't rely on markets to solve this for us. That's just, in my opinion, the
This
reality.
is the wood market guy.
Yeah, I mean, there's a role to be played, right? But like particularly on the biomass side, like California's doing some interesting things in terms of aggregation yards, and I think there's recognition there. Like we do have a role in terms of setting the stage for transport, executing helping execute these projects or executing them, transport, aggregation, and we have to play a complementary role to industry. So.
Yeah, when I was just talking to Nick about this, we started off our journey with a different partner, a different private partner that was much more focused on the profit side of things whenever we were building this biochar idea. And that clashed with us because what we wanted to provide first was that service. We wanted to be able to provide the service of having a place where community members and contractors and our Forest Service partners could drop this wood off at no cost to them. So that was our main priority, and it eventually led to us breaking ways with our initial private partner and finding another one that was more in line with what we wanted to provide, and they were wholly focused on the carbon credit side of things. And since we could not provide exact numbers for the feedstock, we couldn't provide how much carbon credits we would be able to provide them and make them solvent.
I think what's missing is financial support and assurances for land managers. Two examples would be, we hear this a lot, private landowners, producers, they're land rich, cash poor, and they're not willing to take the risk. There's a lot of opportunity for impact on their lands, but they're not willing to take the risk because they're worried that they're not going to get reimbursed by the Farm Bill or other projects that would land management activities that would make their lands more resilient to wildfire and things like that. And then on the Forest Service side, they know exactly what needs to be done. The science is there. It's about the support on how exactly this biomass is going to be removed and utilized. I gave that example of the timber truck and just how much needs to be removed. And so we're hopeful with the Wildfire Innovation Fund and other financial vehicles that we can support that as well.
Yeah, to stay, I guess, on that point of scale for another second, I feel like a lot of the examples that we're talking about or even seeing on the carbon credit side and on the finance side are most comfortable with very, very large projects and with both insurable and financeable projects. And I just wonder, what that means, how to create, if there are ideas you all have about how to create more space for participation in these programs or resources for small landowners, for tribal nations, for managers who are doing the work on the ground who might not have the same kind of financing for either set-asides or forest restoration work, or that either a really large manager like a Port Blakely or someone who's doing FSC management might have, but how to really expand access to some of these programs. or if there's really a way to keep to further diversify, who can participate. Or do you guys not see that as a problem necessarily?
No, I think you nailed it. I think that for the big projects, for the Forest Service, recently, since we've been having some of these large, fires that have destroyed whole communities, I think there's been a lot of attention and funding for those types of projects. And what we were seeing in Douglas County was that some of these large landowners, 10 to 50 acres, they didn't qualify for those types of grants, and that's why we started this micro grant program. We will offer up to $25,000, which isn't enough for large projects, but we have the State Forest Service and we have the U.S. Forest Service that are doing those bigger projects. So we're trying to connect the Forest Service projects through the private lands and these smaller projects through this micro grant.
I want to make sure we have room for some time for some questions from the audience. I think we have like 10 more minutes, something like that. Yeah, we have one right now. It's got a mic for you. Thanks.
Hello. Thank you for your presentations. Heard a lot about the current short-term severe issue of fuels buildup in the forests in the West in general, and also in the East. I think it's a different topic, but it's definitely something that's occurring here too. So yeah, I've heard a lot about that short-term kind of emergency issue. I'm wondering if there's been any thought towards the longer-term, like long rotation, selective logging, and frankly higher quality lumber, coming out of these longer rotation and more kind of interactively logged lots or whatever, operations. Wondering if you guys have any thoughts on that, because I think that's obviously also relevant to fire resilient forests, right? Like, in the short term, you've solved this active management problem, but in the long term, I think we need to be, I'm just thinking about different standards. So wondering if there's any work towards that on your guys' end at the moment.
I think that's you.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's funny because I was thinking today, and I don't know if this is a dumb idea, but like you're at these things and the juices are flowing. Was like, it's hard to incentivize landowners that are practicing sort of standard business as usual rotation lengths to move to a long rotation model, because there's all sorts of mechanisms there, including the primary financial mechanism, right, that dictates that. What's interesting is that if you grow to a biological rotation age, right, you're actually going to put more carbon on the tree per year, and you'll end up with different quality fiber at the end of the day. So it's kind of this paradox in my mind as to why it's not done more, and it's complex. But what is interesting is back to sort of mills being overwhelmed. There's this push to get more done at the same time that we don't have the infrastructure there to take care of it. And so I was thinking today, I was like, what would be cool is if you could create an incentive whereby you could basically encourage mills to take on more fiber from restoration projects at the same time that you diverted the fiber they would rely upon from industrial lands, under the pretense that those industrial lands added 10 years to their rotation length, like a deferment program almost. So something like that would be really interesting if you wanted to tether it back to restoration. Maybe I'll just leave it at that. Yeah.
I think long term, if we're talking about, managing our forests, it all comes back to just getting fire back on the ground. Our ultimate goal, managing public lands, is to get the forest back to a state where you can put prescribed fire back on the ground and use that, because no matter how efficient you make mechanical treatments, it's never going to be able to cover the amount of acreage and be as beneficial as just getting fire back to the landscape. So that's always been our goal is get our projects to where they can accept fire safely and it's not going to get into the canopy and having that low, intensity burn.
Yeah, I mean, I think to just chime in for 1 second on that question, I think and to tie it back to maybe some of the conversations last night and this morning, I think there's a strange unease in the land management, forest sector, forest product world where there's so much amazing research about what could be done and a whole diversity of forest management. If you go to any forestry conference or have any group of wood nerds together, it's there's just an incredible diversity of what could happen, and this kind of collective head scratching about why it's so challenging to push from how many landscapes are managed right now and switch it over into another state. And so this shift from shorter rotation to longer rotation, you can run models and the fiber amount pencils out, but that's a great example where there's this 15 or 20 year period where it does not pencil out, right? And if that land is managed by a timber investment management company or a bank or a hedge fund, we maybe need new economic models to think about or regulatory models, I don't say that when I'm on the West Coast, that would, support that transition, right? Not force it, but say, okay, how would that model shift? But as I think as speakers have pointed out, there's a lot of little pieces like that, right? Where there's really and similarly, there are so many incredible, often smaller or more interested land managers that are testing out all sorts of really interesting things. But there's a lot of challenges to kind of carrying that over to bigger landscapes or bigger parcels. And so, I don't know, it'd be interesting to see how that work gets supported or incentivized. And I've always thought being on the building industry side, just to give a shout to Sustainable Northwest, I think we need more players who can kind of hinge in the middle, and say if the folks buying wood products, if there's no market for the quote unquote special wood, the climate smart wood, the carbon smart wood, whatever people want to brand it as, it's hard to give that signal and that shove to an industry to kind of shift gears. But similarly, if the folks on the market side buying product, if all that extra capital just goes to manufacturers and doesn't get back to land managers and back to the people doing the work, we're also not setting up an equitable system at all. So I don't know how that larger ecosystem of relationships gets kind of stitched back together, but it doesn't seem like our typical market capitalism is geared up for that challenge, right? Of finding that diversity of the fiber economy. But I don't know, maybe finance will actually offer some, options there of how we could be incentivizing those different services. I really appreciated that framework that you started with, of that the beneficiaries could be separate from the owners or might be separate from this really product-centric market view.
Yeah, I think with certain beneficiaries, it's been about trust and dipping their foot in, seeing demonstrated success. So we've been speaking to certain utilities in the West for years and years and felt no progress. And then a project gets going that's funded by another beneficiary. And then they're like, oh, actually, we're really interested in carbon or avoided emissions. And then they're willing to take that first little dip of 50K or something small. And then it just starts to kind of roll. The other thing I'll say is that we started with fuels reduction projects on public lands, and it's not a plug and play thing. There's a whole new set of actors on different land management types, different ecosystems, different benefits that you're trying to monetize. And so it's really been we built over 5 years the Forest Resilience Bond for public lands, and it's not just okay, now we can transfer it to tribal lands. There's a lot of new relationships, science, collaboration that needs to happen.
One last question. Here.
I actually have a whole other scenario for all of you. So in tribal lands, in our territory, like I said last night, we started out to burn for basket materials. And then we had a lot of young people come in and say, you need to create biochar. You need to have all this equipment to do this. And we're like, but we're still trying to restore the basket materials. Next, we're restoring the land. We're doing broadcast burning over hundreds of acres. And we don't do the mechanical treatments ahead of time. You know, we put in line, obviously, 6 to 10 feet around, you know, and down to bare minimal soil around every unit we do. And then we just burn that interior off, and that goes through a rotation. Anything that we do bring down, tree-wise, whether it's a hardwood, fir, whatever, gets cut up and utilized for our elders, because we still are in a very rural area and depend on solar and wood for heating. And so, you know, listening to everybody, it's just, civilization sounds so wonderful. It doesn't exist everywhere. And so, you know, how does that happen for those peoples? And I often get asked those same questions, and I'm like, I really don't know. Because like I said, we built this organization to burn for a specific resource. And now we've grown to the point where our community wants more. So we're constantly looking for funds to make these things happen for our younger generations that want to have the biochar, that want to have all these other resources that are coming out of these forests. But unless we leave our little cocoon and come outside and visit with everybody, we don't know about all these things that are happening in the world. And a lot of our elders choose to stay in their little cocoon forever and expect the rest of us to come out into the world and find out what's happening and bring it home to them. So this has been a great learning experience for me, thank you. But we're not all the same.
Okay, I wanted to thank Steph and this panel for fantastic discussion. So thank you, panel 2, towards forest restoration bioeconomy. That was great. We are running a little bit behind, but what symposium, wouldn't be at this point in the afternoon? So I would say we've been consistently about 15 to 20 minutes behind. I propose we try to make up a little bit of that time during the scheduled break. And so if we can take a slightly shorter break, maybe we can do, I didn't bring my phone up here. It's 3:47. So if we can be back here to restart at 3:55, I think we will get close to where we need to be. So grab a coffee, soda, use the restroom, and let's restart again with panel 3 at 3:55. Thank you.